Republicans can't afford to divide in two camps with separate agendas if they want to develop a message for all Oregonians and actually win statewide election. That's according to the Oregonian editorial on March 18th, just a few days ago. Welcome to People, Places, and Politics. I'm Patty Milne, your host, and I'm so delighted today to have a really special guest with me, W. Scott Jorgensen. As we look at the future, the past, what happened in the most recent election, there have been a lot of opinions and a lot of conversations taking place. I'm very excited to have you join me today, Scott, because you have just an extraordinary perspective, and we'll get to that in just a moment. I'd like to introduce you, Scott, to the audience. Scott began his career as an award-winning small-town newspaper reporter for various publications throughout Oregon. He was also a news director and talk show host for the Grants Pass Broadcasting Corporation and also a field organizer for a successful statewide ballot measure campaign in 2012. Scott is the author of 2 books, and the more recent one is titled Conversations with Atia. And while I did not have the opportunity to read that, you did share with me many excerpts and a lot of background information. Hence, this very unique perspective that you bring to what's happening in the Republican Party today and what happened in the election. So my question, Scott, is what would Atia do? If Governor Atia were here today, what advice would he give to the Republican Party? And of course, the the long-standing Dorchester Conference just took place a couple of weekends ago. And at the same time, an alternative, I believe you could say, a second annual Freedom Rally taking place at a different location same weekend for Republicans and like-minded individuals to talk about issues and the future. That was where this quote from the Oregonian came from, because they did report on these 2 gatherings. And you gave a speech at the Dorchester Conference, and if I understood correctly, kind of going back to, referring back to your knowledge and conversations with Governor Atia.
Yeah, the theme was the past, present, and future of the Republican Party in Oregon. And what I did was I started off with a history lesson, because a lot of people don't know this, but up until the 1950s, this was a one-party state with Republicans in charge of everything. And so I started off saying, once upon a time, there was a party in a state, and really laid it out for them. You know, out of 90 legislative seats, they only had 15. The national level hadn't elected a U.S. senator in 40 years, all these things. And by the way, I'm talking about the Democrats in Oregon. And so you get caught up in the here and now, and you lose perspective on these things. And history ebbs and it flows, and there's actions and reactions. And so it's really easy for people to be discouraged after this last election. But there's also challenges, and there's opportunities and things that could be done differently.
So what would Atia recommend to us today in this current situation?
Well, I think one of the things he would say is, stop fighting among yourselves. Now, I've been involved in this in some level or another for about 10 years now, since my early 20s, and I've seen a lot of that at the county level, at the state level, and it has not served us well. And that's how you lose elections. Cycle after cycle is if you have half of the party fighting with the other half of the party.
Couldn't you say, though, that's what happens in families? You don't always agree, but ultimately, in the end, you're family? Or is that not really?
There is that. You can have disagreements. I mean, for example, the Dorchester Conference last year, you had that conference and you had the other event, but there was a lot of division even at the Dorchester Conference. You had a U.S. Senate primary that was very hotly contested, and a lot of people walked away from that event with hurt feelings because it had gotten so nasty among people that are supposedly on the same side.
Well, but let me say, and I was not able to attend Dorchester this year. We were out of town doing some other things. But I was there last year, and see, I had forgotten already. Was it, so my question is, was it really that contentious. Again, it's family, it's hundreds of people with different ideas and perspectives. And so are we just not good at accepting each other's differences? Or are the differences so diverse, so broad, that we'll never come together?
Well, I think one of the phrases that has harmed the party tremendously is rhino, Republican in name only. Because the fact of the matter is, this is a very diverse state, geographically and in terms of the people and their attitudes. And you can be very, very conservative in some areas of the state, but if you're in a moderate district, the voters tend to be more moderate. If you have, you know, a voter registration split that's more even, or if you're in a Democratic district, you're unelectable if you take the hardline conservative position. And so we don't really do ourselves any favors by saying, this guy took this one position, therefore he's a rhino and he's not a Republican and we need to kick him out of the party, because that hasn't worked well for us.
So when did all this come to be, this not accepting each other?
Well, it's been around for a while, and it keeps getting worse, and that's one of the things I mentioned in my speech at Dorchester, is that we have contested primaries. The other guys have contested primaries. The difference is that after the contested primaries, the other guys aren't bloody and bruised, and we do that to ourselves, and whoever wins the primary election on the Republican side doesn't really much look like a winner, and all their opposition research for the Democrat has already been done for them. They just have to pull the negative ads that were run in the primary, and I've seen this happen cycle after cycle, and to me that's the dictionary definition of insanity, just doing the same thing over and over and over again.
But wasn't it this way years ago, decades ago?
Well, I don't know, I wasn't around. Well,
won't history tell us that, I guess what I'm asking is, it seems to me, through my experiences, part of what you're saying I can relate to, but there's also a part of me that if we're really going to take the high road and try to get Republicans elected in these terribly, terribly messy primaries, both the loser and the winner, if you can call one a loser and the other a winner, the prevailing individual, if both of the candidates would take the high road and say, all right, fair and square, all right, Scott, you won, I didn't, but I'm going to be here to help you beat the Democrat. So what you're saying is that's not happening.
That didn't happen last year after the primary.
And there are a couple of races that we could point to say that. But
and you're right, and that's one of those things you're supposed to do. You do the concession speech, and then you do kind of your statewide victory tour, and you get the endorsements of all the people that had run against you and said, okay, well, we're done fighting each other. Now it's time to go on to the general and win this thing outright. But there were a lot of things, you know, especially for the U.S. Senate race, that weren't done right or that weren't done at all that should have been done.
So is this part of training? Is this something that we need to do, we as Republicans need to do better training of candidates, that you need to be nice if you don't win, or if you win, you need to be more
conciliatory?
Well, not conciliatory, but a little bit more respectful and inclusive. And I know, reading through some of the materials you shared with me, that was Atiyeh, and when he beat
Robert Straub?
Yes, and that, all right, come to work for me, help me out. We're not enemies, we just have differing opinions of how to solve problems.
Yeah, in fact, the foreword for the biography of Robert Straub was written by Vic Atiyeh, and they had faced off against each other a couple of times, and Robert Straub won the first time, Vic Atiyeh won the second time, but they still had that tremendous respect for each other. And you know, ultimately, you look back to times when the Republican Party has been successfully. You look at the 1980s, for example, they had the big tent philosophy, and you had a lot of the same elements that are still in the party, and yet they still somehow all managed to get along for long enough to win elections. And I haven't been seeing so much of that here in Oregon for as long as I've been involved in this.
I think there's some people, though, who look at some of the issues how things have changed in the last decade, the last 20 years. What used to be normal, moderate, now is not. Particularly with social issues, what some, and particularly, and Governor Atiyeh was in the generation of my parents, and so I see when I, like say, going through your materials and what I do know about the politics at that time, while the issues weren't different, the approach was different, the perspective was different, and so some people are much quicker to accept new social norms, and I'm just picking on, we can talk about
Sure.
taxes and government bureaucracy also that has changed dramatically. So some people want to hold on to some more traditional values, others say, times are changing, let's just get on with it. But this also is a message, or maybe a lesson too, that for Republicans to win, it really, what's the most important thing in government?
Well, at the end of the day, right, elections are about numbers, and this is basic math. I have a 7-year-old, he's learning these things, and you get there by multiplication, you get there by addition, you don't get there by subtraction and division, and I think that we've been doing way too much of that.
And then, of course, in the legislature, it's all about the first vote. It's, you know, if you're in the House, who's going to be the Speaker, and in the Senate, who's going to be the Senate President. And if we want to continue to have and those two individuals have a lot of power over the agenda, the bills and policies. If nothing else, if as a Republican maybe a candidate is either too liberal or too conservative for you, the main thing is, well, who do you want running the show? Ultimately, who do you want calling the shots?
Well, right, and you have a purity test, and you say, well, this guy's only 90% there, so he's no good, but maybe that guy's a good fit for the district. Maybe he's well-liked by his neighbors. Maybe he's electable. So are you really willing to sacrifice that 10% of things that you don't agree with him on to have the seat still be held by a Democrat?
So is that one of the things that, as we go forward and look at the upcoming elections, which will be here before we know it, do we need to impress on the party members that, or still try to jockey for the policy control?
Well, I think every district is unique, and I travel all over this state quite frequently. I mean, I was just over in Pendleton and was in Seaside just before that. I get down to Southern Oregon quite a bit, and it's one of the things I love about this state. It is the incredible diversity. You know, you have deserts, you have beaches, you have mountains. A lot of states don't have that, right? And we have these wonderful communities all over the place, and candidate recruitment is critical. And you need people who are a good fit for their districts. And you know, does this person meet the complete ideology test? At the end of the day, a lot of Oregon politics is personality driven. And there are a lot of, you know, some Democrats in the legislature who are from districts that are pretty moderate, and you look at the numbers and say, wow, but this person still wins consistently beyond the margins of what the registration advantage is. Well, why is that? Well, because people like them, because they know them, because they've been around for a while. And that makes it really difficult to, you know, try to unseat them, especially if you're going scorched earth and you're trying to tell people that the person they've been voting for a decade is a bad person. People really don't like that. So what do you see, what are the major issues? You are working in the Senate. What direction are things taking? What are you most concerned about, most excited about? Well, there's some really bad bills. I mean, the first day of session, you had public hearings on very, very divisive issues, and I don't seem to recall anybody campaigning on this clean fuels program, and yet that was day one, already signed into law right now, when you already have a bunch of really good bills that are still making their way through the process. And this thing is directly and specifically mentioned in a federal subpoena, word for word, and yet it's law. So that's very concerning. And we also have this bill, House Bill 2386, that grants a lot of authority to the Labor Commissioner to issue cease and desist orders against businesses who are suspected of wrongdoing. Right now, that's typically done through the courts. And what this bill does, some of the amendments to it, is replaces in current statute court with commissioner repeatedly. And that's a lot of consolidation of power within the executive branch.
Wouldn't that, isn't there potential for that to be found unconstitutional? Or, I mean, that a business no longer has the right to due process?
It should be concerning to business owners all over the state, and I think coalitions are starting to form around it. I know the Farm Bureau's coming out against it, Associated Oregon Industries, and we did a newsletter about it on Monday trying to get the word out to folks that this is something that they should be watching and be very concerned about.
But as you pointed out, and as most of our audience probably is aware, the Democrats can pretty much do whatever they want. They have control of both chambers. And of course, our new governor does not seem to hesitate to make sure that her personal agenda has already moved forward, and other bills that she likely is going to be supportive of, no questions asked, she'll sign them.
Well, yeah, and that's what I think a lot of folks in the building realize, that yes, we did have a change in governor, but it's not like she's going to sign a bunch of bills that Kitzhaber would have vetoed or the other way around, and the legislative agenda is still much the same.
Yeah. So what can people do, businesses? And I was not aware, and I probably keep, even though I'm no longer a part of the elected process here, but keeping track of what's going on, I was not aware. I'm a small business owner. How are small businesses going to know about this bill?
No, that's a good question. One of the great things is that the legislative website, OregonLegislature.gov, is very user-friendly. It has a lot of information on there, and it gives you the ability also to find who your legislator is. A lot of legislators do regular newsletter updates, including our office. We do one once a week, and it's a good way to keep on top of it. There's also groups like the Oregon Citizens Lobby, and it's just regular people constantly, as opposed to professional lobbyists who have particular agendas, and they review bills based on the principles of limited government and how it applies there. And you know, I go visit them ever so often in their war room and tip them off to some bills, and sometimes they tip us off to things. The thing is that there's so many bills moving through the process that when you're in a legislative office, everything's kind of siloed. You're paying attention mostly to the things that are coming up in your boss's committee, for example. And we read all the third readings that come through on the Senate side. I mean, I read each and every one of those bills, and so does my boss. But there's hundreds and hundreds of bills to keep track of, and you would go insane trying to keep track of all of them at once.
Well, and that's what part of my interest in doing this program is, to provide information to the viewers, to the audience that is not ordinarily available, or maybe not, maybe it's buried deep in the newspaper somewhere. So would you mention again, Scott, the bill and a basic summary of what it does, why it's detrimental to our businesses, and what people can do? Call your office, and again, who they might get in touch with for some help on this.
Well, House Bill 2386, and it passed out of committee over on the House side, and I think a floor vote is pending, depending on when this airs. It might have already happened, but there's still opportunities to stop it over in the Senate. And this is the bill that would authorize the Labor Commissioner to issue cease and desist orders to businesses based on allegations of wrongdoing. And it's done through the courts right now, where BOLI, the Bureau of Labor and Industries, will take a case and get the facts and present it to the court so the court can decide. So there's some due process there. There's provisions that would require bonding, and the bonding would be in an amount determined by BOLI. Right, and the burden would then be on the business owner to prove that this is too much. And there's also some language in there, either in the bill or in proposed amendments, about enjoining businesses. So business owners should be very worried about this.
Well, it also, it's pulling the welcome mat out from under businesses that are considering moving here. That if I were a particularly small
absolutely.
businesses that don't have the staffs of attorneys and people constantly watching for things like this, you just can't survive with that kind of cloud constantly hanging over you. So this is very anti-business, small and large business.
Well,
So.
and there's the administrative rules component of it too, because
Yeah.
once you grant that broad rulemaking authority through this kind of bill, then the agency can make, and we have a bill aimed at that too, that's House Bill 2497, and that would require natural resource agencies to notify if they're going to do an administrative rules action at some point in the state, that they have to tell and notify the legislators who represent that district. That came about because the Water Resource Department had tried doing some of that down in Klamath in my boss's district.
Yeah.
And we found out about it and sounded the alarm and worked with some of the local officials and in the local news outlets to get the word out. And we did a newsletter about that fairly recently where we asked the state archivist, how many administrative rules are there?
Oh,
offhand,
probably don't want to know.
offhand, she didn't know. And so she computed an average for us, and we ran through the numbers, but if you divided it by the number of business days in a biennium, it turns out that there's a new administrative rule every 15 minutes.
Yep.
So try to keep track of that.
You can't.
With,
you just can't.
with the
Yeah.
Boley Bill, 2386, what my boss had me do was, he said, okay, see all these statutes mentioned in here?
Yeah.
Pull those up. And I did, and it was like a phone book.
Wow.
Right? And so it took me all day to go through it and just to summarize, okay, these are the sections dealing with this and that. So you're the average small business owner who's trying to keep the lights on and keep the employees paid, and you're having to still have a law degree to keep up on these things. And that's just
Or-
the stuff that's already in statute, not to mention the administrative rules that would be required to fully implement it.
Ooh, this is a Full Employment Act for attorneys. However, as I mentioned before, just with current regulations and the bureaucracy and the regulations constantly just burying business people, it takes them away from doing their job that keeps their business doors open. So this is a bad, bad bill, very
The cost
bad
of
bill.
compliance is not
Yeah.
insignificant.
So, yeah. Is there another bill that you want to caution people to keep an eye out for?
Well, there's one that's on the Senate floor tomorrow, but we'll see, depending on when this airs. But, Metro up there in Portland has, really, really wants this hotel with the convention center, and they don't seem to be able to draw private investment for it. You figure, well, if this is such a good idea.
So the taxpayer ought to pay for it.
Well, so they're proposing a bill that would kind of change those conditions and say, oh, well, but if you enter into an intergovernmental agreement, then that could be an option instead. So it's kind of an end run around the current statutory provisions requiring voters to say, yeah, we'll pay for that.
Oh my gosh. So we have a few minutes left. We kind of diverted. I know you really, we came to this today to talk about, so what's in the future? What would Governor Atiyeh, if he were still with us, what would he recommend or advice he'd give? Any further thoughts on that?
Well, some of it's messaging. This time last year, I was part of a group that went all over the state, and we just talked to folks and heard what they had to say about things. And it confirmed my long-held suspicions that the messaging that Republicans are using is not working.
And why? Why is that? What's wrong with the message?
Well, one of the examples I gave in my speech at Dorchester was telling poor people that they're poor because they're lazy doesn't make those people want to vote for you.
Right.
There's a lot of people working really hard to be poor in this state.
Yeah.
For example, when we talk about food stamps a lot, the true issue is hunger. And when we did these focus groups, we'd show a picture of a food stamp, and the reaction from most of the people was, thank God for food stamps, right? And we've kind of lost touch with that, and surely there's a waste, fraud, and abuse in the system, undoubtedly, but enough people are on them or have been on them over the years to where it's threatening to them when you use that kind of language and when you talk about food stamps. No, we have one of the highest hunger rates in the nation. Talk about that instead.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's part of it, is be inclusive. And Governor Atiyeh grew up in an ethnically diverse neighborhood in Portland, and because of that, he grew up just viewing people as people. And we've kind of gone in the opposite direction, where we try to micro-target and say, okay, well, let's develop one message for this guy based on consumer data that we have, and then we'll send him a mailer that says this thing, and then his neighbor, well, we'll write a different message for that guy and send it. But these guys are going to talk to each other at some point. They both go to the mailbox together, get the mail piece, and say, hey, look what the Republicans are sending me. Oh, wow, it's different than what they're sending me.
But the Democrats do that too. They really do the target. I guess when we were just chatting briefly before the program began, what concerns me, and your point is an excellent one, but the liberals, and I'll just say liberals for a moment, have done such a good job of making every group a victim, whether it's women, minorities, children, the disabled, the elderly, everyone. You're a victim because, and it's out of your control, and it's out. They don't even want to talk about individual circumstances or individual responsibility. And I'm not meaning to get away from. There was a time in my life, struggling to get my feet back on the ground that,
Sure.
Thank goodness for food stamps when I had 2 small children. So, and people do struggle, and that was something I heard in my most recent campaign. So your point is right on. But how do Republicans, though, counter when Democrats are, well, we're here to save you. We're here to give you whatever you need. I mean, it's like Santa Claus every day of the year. We're going to take care of you, and you've been victimized, and those mean, horrible, selfish Republicans don't care about you. So we do need a message that doesn't demean people in their individual circumstances, that understands their individual circumstance, but also gives them a more positive alternative rather than false promises that we're going to take care of you, and actually the victimization continues instead of helps them improve their life.
I just think that people are more likely to believe you if you say, I feel your pain, if you aren't doing a fundraiser at a golf course country club and talking about capital gains taxes. And I mentioned that in the speech too, and some of the supply side economic guys, kind of cringed.
Yeah.
Look, at the end of the day, ask the serving staff around here at the conference if they care about the capital gains tax. And if they think that if you give their boss's boss a tax cut, that somehow that's going to help them out at some point. You won't. You'll lose them. You really want to keep them on. Talk about how people are taxed on anticipated tips in the service industry. And
Right.
I have friends that work in the service industry and say, give me one reason to vote Republican. And that's what they see. Here you guys are hanging out at the country club and talking about capital gains taxes while we're over here being hungry, and the other guys are saying, I feel your pain.
So that is, and we're going to have to really stop there, Scott, but the question is, Republicans need to feel the pain, and many of us have had personal experiences and have felt the pain. So we have to message that where it's authentic. But I want to thank you very much again, Scott, for coming to visit with me and share this information, and I hope you'll come back and talk about what's happening at the legislature.
Yeah, well, it's just about within walking distance, although I do admit that I did drive.
Okay.